Well, if you have your Bibles tonight, Ecclesiastes chapter number 2. This is part 2 of the message I began this morning, Searching for Meaning, the search for meaning. And we've been in this study now for a couple messages on Ecclesiastes. And so we have Solomon, as we learned this morning, was searching for meaning in the cycle of life. He searched for meaning in human reason. He called it wisdom, and we recognize, we'll continue to recognize that what he called wisdom and was more of his own human reason, his heart. He gave his heart to seek out things that if he had true spiritual wisdom, he would not have sought those things out. And so we understand that wisdom in a general sense can mean knowledge. That's the way a lot of people use wisdom, as just knowledge. But spiritual wisdom is the ability to use knowledge correctly, using it properly. When we start tying in the principles of the Word of God, it is how we're directed by God. With wisdom comes discretion. Discretion is the ability to make the right decision. And that is something that is very important for us to understand. And so as we look at this part 2 of Searching for Meaning, or Search for Meaning, in this series of True Happiness from the book of Ecclesiastes, let's begin in verse number 1. And I'll read down through just a few verses. And I have our next 2 points covering about half of the passage. The next point is covering the verse number 11, 1 through 11. And then we have 12 through 26. And in there's some little nuggets I want to bring out. If I wanted to take the time, I could spend so much more time in each one of these sections, but there is a fear for me going through this book of getting redundant, where you feel like you're hearing the same thing over and over again. So I want to be careful as I go through. I'll be accentuating certain truths and trying not to be so redundant as we go through this. But I think tonight, these next 2 points, making a total of 4 points for this message of searching for meaning, I think it'll drive home the message quite well. So in Ecclesiastes chapter number 2, beginning in verse number 1, notice what he says here again. I said in what? Mine heart. And I mentioned this again this morning. I mentioned it in the introduction. I believe this is where Solomon went wrong. When he set his heart to certain desires, he kind of threw caution to the wind, as wise as he was. And he even makes a statement, I think we'll see in here tonight, that he still had his wits about him according to him. He still, with wisdom, sought after folly and madness. Now think about that statement. If true wisdom is spiritual, it came from God. He was gifted by God with certain spiritual insight, certain wisdom, but yet he still sought after madness and folly, and he said, but I still had wisdom with me. It's kind of an interesting statement to make that statement, because he may have still had knowledge of God. He may still have had the knowledge of right and wrong, but wisdom would have told him, Solomon, don't go down this path. Don't seek after these things. You don't need to know this kind of information. But yet, he seems to give his heart to seek out things that he should have never allowed his heart to seek out. And much like us, sometimes we throw caution to the wind and we just say, well, I'm going for it. I don't care about the consequences. And when the consequences come, sometimes we say, God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? I'm a good person. What did I do to you? And we don't want to suffer the consequences of our own rash decision. So we'll start here again in verse number 1. I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Now the word mirth there is joy. In the Hebrew, it's actually simcha. As I was studying this last week, I mentioned to my wife, I said, if we ever get another animal, so that'd be a cool name. Simcha. Come here, Simcha. No? Okay. I just thought it was a cool name. Anyways, joy. So what are you saying here? I will prove thee with joy. He says to his own heart, I'm going to prove thee with pleasure. I'm going to seek out pleasure for myself. This is Solomon's wisdom. This is what he's saying. And it gets into much more detail here as we'll learn here. That's why I say the wisdom that he's talking about here is not wisdom from God. This is man's idea of wisdom. This is man's thought. Man, the more knowledge I gain, the wiser I'll be. Joy what? Well, that could be a statement written on just about anything today. Come on, it's all about just enjoying life. Man, if you can't find happiness in this life, you're going to be a miserable person. Man, live, eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow you die. Let's just enjoy life. Find something that brings you happiness, right or wrong. As long as you're happy, And this is the entitlement society that we live in. They want you to just find happiness without regard to principle. And that's not what our God teaches in true wisdom at all. And so we go on here then. He's looking now, he's turning his heart over towards searching for pleasure. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth or joy, what doeth it? So at the conclusion of it, he's realizing it really does nothing for you. I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine. Well, this just adds even, to it. Well, I don't find enough pleasure just in laughter. I don't find enough pleasure in entertainment. I need to add something else to it to up this. I got to have a feeling now. I got to have more of an emotion. I have to have more of a fix to make me even happier. And so he was learning about what man finds what brings man pleasure in the lacks of not having, in the inability of finding pleasure just in the normal things. He has to up it now and go into alcohol in order to bring other types of stimulus to his heart and his mind. So I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom. So here again he's saying, I still have wisdom about me. That was the drive, acquainting my heart with wisdom, and lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees of all kinds of fruits. I made pools of water, the water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens and servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above that there were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever my eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of my labor. Then I looked on all the works of my hands that I had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. Remember this morning I mentioned that the phrase there, vexation of spirit, means grasping at the wind, trying to grab something that is unattainable. And this is his final comment, verse 11, of all those things he sought after. And yet he said wisdom was still with him. Father, now with these words in our mind, I ask that in the few moments that we have, that you would please give me the ability to speak clearly about Solomon's experience and the foolishness of some of the decisions that he made, but then also that it might guard us from making the same foolish decisions, and that we learn from the illustrations that are even in our same day and age, understanding that there are so many illustrations around us, perhaps even our own family and friends and people that we see in the news and the media that search after the same things that Solomon searches after, and yet they end up many times distraught, broke, despair, broken relationships, wondering what is the purpose of life. And would you please help us as Christians to know the truth about a life of meaning, the true understanding of meaning. The search for meaning is found in you, O God. May we find fulfillment in that for ourselves, so we might be able to educate others in that same knowledge. Help us to glean from Solomon's lesson, but Lord, also help us to avoid the same pitfalls that he allowed himself to give his heart to. So we'll ask for your blessings now in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I mentioned this morning, we looked at Solomon's search for meaning in the cycle of life. We saw that he searched for meaning in human reason. He said in verse number 16 of chapter 1, I communed with my own heart. As I mentioned, I believe this is where he went wrong, communing with his own heart instead of asking God, God, should I participate in this thing? Because I think he would have heard a resounding, no, Solomon, why would you even think that? But yet he communed in his own heart. He sought after what he thought was right. Even though he mentions a couple times that his wisdom was still with him, that in some cases even makes it harder for us to understand. He's in a sense, a very contradictory statements. And later on we'll see this where he makes some positive statements about God, but then goes right back to saying that all this is vexation of spirit. And for Solomon writing at the latter years of his life and after living a life really for him of great blessing, exponential blessing, yet also knowing that at the end of Solomon's life there was great turmoil. The kingdom was getting ready to be divided, and many of the sins that he participated in that pulled his heart away from his God, even though he had wisdom, according to him, he was making bad choices. And so we find here in chapter 2 and verse number 1 through 11, we see the search for meaning in pleasure. The search for meaning in pleasure. Allow me, if you would, just for a few moments to read you an article that I found online. It's from an online site called Market Watch. And it was an article that was just doing an interview on a filmmaker who did a film about the wealth culture. The wealth culture. Her name was Lauren Greenfield. And I just want to read you a few excerpts out of this because it says a lot about our current culture. And something that Solomon experienced, but it's also now a common thing for people to be searching after this wealth culture. She actually calls it wealth culture addiction. But I want you to note what she says here. In Generation Wealth, that's the name of the movie that she's coming out with. And not that I'm promoting that. I'm just saying here in this article, I've not seen it, but in this article, I understand it tells us a lot about her perspective. Greenfield interviews a range of characters, and these are all people who have made their millions in different ways. Some in honest ways and some in dishonest ways. But she also, as she mentions in here, that Greenfield also quizzes members of her own family about their attitudes to money and fame. In most cases, the discussion revolves around the great lengths to which people went to make more money and how it left them ultimately feeling unfulfilled. Wealth culture addiction is a phenomenon that is growing and widespread. Greenfield told Market Watch ahead of the movie's premiere, during the financial crisis, I was looking at wealth in the American dream and how it had gotten bigger and more supersized. And then when I started to look at all the stories, it told about economics, popular culture, gender, the causes of the financial crash, the cause of the financial crash, and the new rich in China and Russia. They told a bigger story that were connected in our culture. They were individual data points that together they documented in a seismic shift about our values. We've gone from a culture that prized hard work, frugality, and discretion as the central tenets of the American dream to a culture that prized celebrity, bling, and narcissism. She contends in a growing addiction, wealth culture is unhealthy and unsustainable for our community, relationships, and well-being. The addiction of consumerism functions like other addictions so that they can be very unhealthy. Part of the cure for Greenfield lies in switching off your TV set, catching up with people next door. A generation ago, people used to compare themselves to their neighbors, she said. Now people spend more time with people they know from TV than their actual neighbors and aspire to this very unrealistic image, whether it's through reality TV or social media, about what life is like. If you checked out on me on all that reading, basically what she's saying is people now are not just comparing themselves with their neighbors, they're now comparing themselves with the reality TV shows and what they see on TV, what they see in the movies, and they see from their rock stars and all these different people that live such a different lifestyle than the normal person. And so in this wealth culture mindset, what she is saying is people have now come with a new level of what they're trying to find, and they're grasping at it, as Solomon says, it's vexation of spirit. I'm grasping at the air, trying to attain something that I'll never attain. And this is she's seeing this as a growing problem in American culture, he said really in several cultures around the world that are doing well financially. And so as we consider this, we see that this is the same problem that Solomon had, in the sense that he justified his willingness to search out all means of pleasure because God gave him wisdom. And he said, because God gave me this wisdom, I'm willing to go and search out all these different types of pleasures, which was the wrong thing for Solomon to do. So I want you to notice here in verse number 2, I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? And so he says of just the common things that he would seek in life, sitting down with your friends and just enjoying some time, having a humorous conversation. Now, I love humor. I love hearing the newest jokes, and as long as they're clean. And I love hearing different things. I like seeing comedy and that kind of stuff. I enjoy that kind of stuff. I like laughter. And we poke fun of each other. And once in a while, I remember, especially during the building program, Brother Mike and Brother Matt and some of the other different guys going to the build program, we would just, sometimes we got to the point where we were so tired, just kind of got giddy. And guys would start making fun. You ever been with people where the puns just keep rolling? Just be talking about one thing, and then it's like, oh my goodness. And we just start laughing at each other and having fun with this. But Daniel, Jim, some of these guys are great at puns, and they just keep the conversation. And you sit there and you start cracking up and laughing. That's all good fun. And it's nice to be able to be entertained with one another and laugh over good, clean things. Solomon got to the point where he said, I find no more pleasure in that. I've got to figure out another way to bring pleasure to myself. And just like some of you, I don't know if I've been caught in the past, especially when I worked in secular field, and somebody would come to the office and they would say, hey, John, you heard this joke yet? And I say, no. And they start telling me a joke, and sadly it was a dirty joke. It was a joke that was not the cleanest joke, and part of you thinks there is humor in that, and you kind of chuckle and you laugh, and then you're like, oh, what did I just do? And you feel bad, you ask the Lord forgiveness real quick, but learning after a while that when somebody comes in from the secular field and asks you if you want to hear a joke, my first question, is it clean? And they started teasing me about that. They're like, you only want to hear a clean joke, what's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with me, I just don't want to hear dirty jokes, And part of that was the fear of I might think that is funny, and some of them are, to be quite honest with you, but at the same time, it's not appropriate. I'm not condemning anybody, just why fill my mind with that junk? And so these are things that you just have to understand. It's not a thou shalt or thou shalt not. It's just a principle. Live your life to honor God. Why seek after those things that even though they may be funny are inappropriate for us as God's followers to entertain ourselves with? But Solomon got to that point. He had to keep finding another pleasure. In his search for wisdom, things had to get more seductive. Things had to get more pleasurable to his fleshly senses, not to his spirit. Do you understand? This is a problem for all of us if we're not careful. We get tired of the Bible. We get tired of church. We get tired of preaching. We get tired of living good. And we want something to bring us satisfaction. And sometimes we get weary in our spirit. We go after fleshly things because it brings an immediate satisfaction, but is fleeting. And I'm not going to get that out of the preacher, that's for sure. He's not that funny. I'm not going to get that out of the music. That's not as entertaining. So I've got to find other forms of entertainment. I've got to find other forms of pleasure. I've got to play hundreds of hours of video games. I've got to watch hundreds of hours of movies. I've got to be on my phone all the time. I've got to be on Netflix. I've got to be on this and that. And we keep seeking for more pleasure, and you just get so tired of it. It drains you. But this is what's going on in our society. And so we find then that Solomon fell in the same trap that many of us will fall into. The typical things of laughter and humor were no longer humorous to him. So verse number 3, he tells us, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine. Well, that's a great way to bring more humor. Let's bring alcohol to this equation. And listen, I've been around alcohol for most of my life. As a boy growing up, I've been around mean drunks, and I've been around funny drunks. I can, in my mind, go back to the different places. But either way, it was not appropriate, and what they tried to do was not appropriate, and the lapse of judgment and discernment because of what alcohol does to us changes people, and they allow themselves to do things and try things that they would never try in their right mind. Isn't that amazing? And today, as a pastor, as a counselor, I deal with it more and more because people are trying to find a salve. They're trying to find something that will bring them temporary satisfaction. If I could just get one more drink, then my nerves will be calm. Now think about this. If it's that bad that a drink will calm your nerves, some of you understand what I'm talking about there. The new normal is drunk. It might be a functional drunk, but they can't be satisfied without the drink. That's a problem. And we understand that much of our society now is cursed with this. More people die of alcohol poisoning than gun deaths. More people die of alcohol poisoning, and you start naming what, you'd be shocked. Go and look at the stats. It's unbelievable. You don't see them trying to outlaw that again, but it's more people are dying from the complications of all types of alcohol. More people have died who are innocent because of that. It's horrible. Years ago, we were at the strip mall. We had a Navy couple here, and one of the gentleman's father came up to help us renovate the strip mall in order to get that ready for our church services. And I did not know the whole story, but her sister, the father, their sister died. It was a drunk driver that crashed into him and killed his daughter. You don't heal from that. That's not one that you just get over. And you understand that how deep that hurts. And yet, as an aside to this, Solomon said, I didn't find pleasure in laughter anymore. I had to find another item to bring into this to make me laugh at things. And anyone who's been around people who are drunk or at parties, you know, it usually gets worse. Our boys played Mystic Little League. I remember pointing it out after we went to one of the Mystic Little League events, a party for the team at a house. And growing up and being around alcohol, I noticed one of the fathers was getting quite flushed in the face, and I noticed that he was getting a little more chummy. And the boys didn't catch on to it. They were young at the time, but, you know, we finally just, we usually at those events came, stayed our little time, and then we got out of there, but we just wanted to show face and show that we weren't just crazy Christians who didn't fellowship with anybody else, and trying to make inroads. But as we were there, I just realized, okay, this is not going the way we want it to go, and so we left, and I explained to them, you know, did you see the change in this particular person? They're like, yeah, we noticed he was being different. Well, he was starting to feel the effects of the alcohol. And so you have to understand, Solomon sought after that which he couldn't find pleasure in the normal things anymore. He now had to seek it out by getting inebriated so he'd have another feeling. People do that with all types of drugs today, over-the-counter drugs that's in your medicine cabinet, on and on. I went a couple weeks ago when I had that sinus infection. Somebody said, oh, you got to go to the pharmacy. It's behind the counter now. You can't get it out on the regular counter. It was some type of Sudafed, D, B, C, whatever it was. I don't know. I got the generic brand, and I was like, what's the purpose of it behind the counter? She goes, well, kids today take it, and they make, you know, other drugs out of it. I was like, oh. Man, kids are smart enough to figure this stuff out now. And I was like, but think about this. Why do kids need this? Why do they need to find something more funny? What is it that they have to find and experience that's going to take away whatever they're facing? And so yet we find that people keep wanting another high. They want another thing to laugh about. They get unfulfilled in what goes on in life, and they start turning dark. They start going after things that are dark, or after things that are sinful, and they know it's not bringing permanent satisfaction, but it brings enough temporal satisfaction, just enough for that time, and they know it's going to wear off, and they'll be back at it again. And it's a cycle they keep going through over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So we see then in verse number 3, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. What he's saying here, yet acquainting my heart, the word acquainting means to be driven by something. He says his desire, he gave himself to wine, but he was still driving, the driving force behind this was wisdom. What he is saying here is that he was trying to prove wine attached to laughter, trying to find out more meaning. But he was saying, I still have my wits about me. You know how many people that after their first drink or their first injection of something or their first smoke of something never come back from that? And yet, this is something that he was willing to go after. And he says, and to lay hold on folly. He was trying to combine wisdom and folly. This just doesn't make any sense to anyone who has a rational mind. Till I might see what was that good for the sons of men. This is where I think he's justifying what he's doing, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. He's saying, hey, I put myself in the position of experimenting. I found no fulfillment in laughter, so I added alcohol to the mix. I added drugs to the mix. I added whatever it was to bring. And he said, I did this with my wits about me, with wisdom, still, so that way I could tell others what they should go after in life. I think that's an excuse. I don't need to experience certain things to tell you not to do it. There's enough illustrations out there in life. There's enough problems that we have in our society. We move on to verse number 4. I made me great works and builded me houses. And so here we now turn to another portion of this and the search for meaning and pleasure. Now we turn to the search for meaning and labor. I know I'm skipping through a bunch of here, but let's skip over to verse number 12. Verse number 12. The search for meaning in labor. There's a couple interesting things that we'll point out in here as we get into this. One that we'll see starting in verse number 12. He speaks of his position as king, but then he's going to start talking about all the things he's labored on. He's going to talk about the vanity of that. And then at the end, verses 24 to 26, he's going to actually teach us something that is useful. So let's start here in verse number 12. Searching for meaning in labor. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath been already done. Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. So here he has this revelation. Wisdom is far superior than folly. Now, don't you think that as God is doing him with wisdom, you've already had that figured out? Don't you think he would have already known that wisdom is far superior than seeking folly? It's the same guy that wrote Proverbs. It's the same guy that had so much wisdom. This is now the latter years of his life, and he's kind of given his history, giving his story. So he's going back into the musing of an old man's mind, talking about his experiential life. And so now he says here that, and I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. So he's talking about seeking all three of these things. And then what's going to happen to the man that comes after me, the king? Verse number 14, he says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. So it's just another word of talking about the wise see what's going on around them, where those who are foolish or acting the fool walk in darkness and don't understand what's going on around them. And I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. What is he talking about here? He's talking about death. Ultimately, we're all going to die. And this is where he's going with this. He said, what's going to happen to the person that comes after me? He said, after I've sought after wisdom and madness and folly, he said, I'm going to die. And then who takes over after I'm gone? Notice what he says here in verse number 15. Then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this is also vanity. Again, what he's saying is, look, after all that I've done, after all that I've accomplished, after all the wisdom I sought and learned, after all the madness and folly, I'm going to die someday, just like the fool's going to die someday. Here's a man with a very negative outlook on life after all that he experienced. He had a very negative outlook on life, and he's going to continue on here with some more negatives about what he experienced in life. And so what he says here then in verse number 16, for there is no remembrance of the wise more than of a fool forever. Seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man as the fool? So he's got a very negative view of even the wise and the fool, knowing that both will come to the same fate, that both are going to die and both are going to be forgotten. Now we have the recordings of Solomon. People are still talking about him. And I thank God that we have the record, and he's left us Ecclesiastes even as a self-confession of what he experienced so that we would know, hey, don't go down those same paths. And then we look here in verse number 17. Notice what he says. Therefore, say it with me, I hated life. Wow. What kind of wisdom is that? This is where he's a very complex thinker. He goes from the extreme of saying wisdom is better than folly, but knowing that I'm going to die and I'm going to leave all this to somebody else, I hate my life. That just doesn't seem to jive with someone who's a wise man. Then he goes on in verse number 17, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun. Now this is very telling, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. That's interesting. Not that I'll have much, but someday I hope to leave my sons something. You know, they might get $10 a piece. Take your mom out for a coffee and a donut. Thank you. You know, whatever. But I mean, if I had castles and houses and lands and everything, I'd be like, hey kids, when I die, you're getting a lot, but I'm going to make you work for everything. Why? Because I love you. I don't want you to be spoiled brats. I want you to understand it takes great work to make this stuff happen. He says that he hated life because he's going to die, and now he's going to leave all that he's built to somebody else. That's selfish. Or was it wisdom in knowing that it also played in what tore his heart away from his God? I see both sides here. I could see him saying, you know what, this madness and folly and this, all that I've done, the next guy that comes up behind me, most likely being one of my sons, he's king, one of my sons is going to come up. I built all this and now he's going to take this over. He's going to go nuts. He's going to go mad. He's not going to know how to handle this. I grew with it. He's just going into it. That's a tough thing to consider. And sometimes I've seen people leave great wealth to their children only to ruin them because their children didn't know how to handle it. And sometimes it's taken them down the wrong path. And so, sadly, we see here that the reasoning behind him hating life was because it was going to be left for others. Secondly, in verses 19 and 20, it says here, and who knoweth whether he shall be wise, a wise man or a fool? And I think that's kind of where he was going. He said, whoever takes over after me, most likely one of my sons, is he going to be wise enough to handle this, or is he going to be a fool? Then it says, yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. He's saying, so all that I put into this, and I'm going to leave it someday, this is just empty to me. It's just worthless. I'm just going to leave this, and what's the use of me leaving all this to somebody else? And verse number 20, therefore I went about to cause my heart to do what? Despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. He actually was getting depressed. Out of all the things he looked at and all the life that he built, and maybe he's coming back to grips with the reality that, man, all that I have pursued, all that I've built, the kingdoms that I've accomplished, the armies, the horses, and the wives, and the children, and oh my goodness, who could even take this over? Who would have the wisdom to even know what to do with all this? And so maybe he's coming back to the realization that he did way too much. He's leaving way too much behind. He says, and it's all just vanity. It's all just empty. Or maybe he is just truly selfish and he doesn't want to leave that to anybody. Then notice in verse number 21 through 23, For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and knowledge and in equity. Yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity. So what he's saying here is, hey, I'm the one who in wisdom and in knowledge and equity built all this, and I'm going to leave it perhaps to somebody who has not even labored for it. And he said, that's just empty to me. Verse 22. For what hath a man of all his labor and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? And so again, he's speaking of the fact that all his labors and everything that he's put into this is empty because he's leaving it, and he's leaving it to somebody who may not even appreciate it. Verse 23, for all the days are sorrows, and his travail grief. Yea, his heart taketh not rest in night. This is also vanity. And I think he's kind of explaining this is how he lived. He was constantly worried about the next thing, constantly worried about the next thing. I've done some research over the years on people who are multimillionaires. Right now, I think the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, $106 billion. Second to him, I think, is Gates still, and I think Gates is 98-something billion dollars. And after that, I think it's Buffett and different ones. And we go down the list of richest men, richest women, and that's across the world. And you realize the wealth that these people get. But do you realize that these people have to pay millions of dollars a year just in security? See, once you get to a level of wealth, you're a target. Once you get to a position where people think that you have something and they could take one of your kids from you and make sure you paid them, they could take a wife, they could hurt you somehow, they could take over a company. They're constantly worried about who's coming after them. What used to be a handshake and a how are you, it's good to see you again, now is what do you want from me? They develop a different mindset. They're now thinking everyone's after them for their money. And it's hard to build a relationship with a person like that because they always think there's an angle that somebody has. Years ago, we had someone attend this church that came into some money, and they went to several different churches, and as people found out that they came into money, they said that the churches they attended, people started asking them for help for different things. And every church that went to, they just left that church. They went to the next church. They wouldn't tell anybody anything. But sooner or later, somebody would talk about how they came into certain money. And I don't know how people found out. And they came to this church. I didn't even know who they were. Didn't even know the story till after they left. But I guess a similar situation. But nobody in the church knew about it that I was aware of. But what I noticed when I was around them, they were very edgy. They were very standoffish. They didn't want to get too close. They were just the type of people that would kind of hold you at arm's length. And I'm the type of person, I just want to get to know you. Can we have coffee together? How you doing spiritually? Are you even saved? I just want to help people to grow in their Christian faith. And I think they were just intimidated because of the friendliness of our church. They were intimidated. And I found out through the people who had invited them to church, they said, no, they have just been hurt so many times, and they're so scared that people are going to find out about their wealth that they just don't get too close to anybody. I said, how sad. How sad that people would want to befriend them just because they think they're going to get something out of them. And yet this is the problem sometimes for people who are very wealthy is they always think someone's after them for their money. And so again, we see Solomon's mindset here. He hated life. He was in despair because of his great wealth and what he was going to leave to perhaps his family and to those who would take over for him. But I want you to notice in verses 24 through 26, the meaning that is found in trusting God. And here I think is a good teaching point for Solomon. And I want you to notice in verse number 24, there is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good of his, what's the word? Labor. One of the things that Solomon is saying is, hey, find fulfillment in your work. Find fulfillment in what you're doing. If it's something that you shouldn't be doing, then stop and find fulfillment in something else. But find fulfillment in your work. Do you recognize that this goes back to one of the truths that God initiated after he created man in the garden? One of the responsibilities of man, he gave them a purpose. What was that purpose for Adam and Eve in the garden? take care of it. Think about that. That was the purpose God gave to Adam and Eve. What was the primary purpose that God gave to Adam and Eve? What is it? Well, that was a rule that he gave them for sure, but the primary purpose was fellowship. He created Adam and Eve so he could have fellowship with them. And he desired to have a relationship with them. Their primary purpose was to glorify God. And they were to, on this earth, work. And that's something that we all need to consider, is that you need to find a life's work, a purpose. Because if you're productive in some area, and I don't care what it is as long as it's honorable, if you find that you're being productive in something, you find that you're keeping yourself busy, it keeps you out of a whole lot of trouble. It keeps you focused on something that is meaningful, especially if it's something that blesses another person. And it's important that we understand that Solomon is teaching a great truth here. He said excuse me, let me read it here for you. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, and it was from the hand of God. He saw that it was the hand of God. You plant in the ground, God allows it to grow up. You eat of that fruit, that food. You are able to drink of the waters that God provides. You're able to work a job in order to earn a living. He said, be satisfied with that. Be satisfied with that. That's one of the purposes God gives you here on this earth, to be satisfied. Such a simple thing. But he says, be satisfied with it. Next, in verse number 25. For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? And you're saying, look, if anyone can talk about eating good, drinking well, having everything, I've got it. He said, just be satisfied with what you're able to do. The work, the line of work you're in, be satisfied with that. Then notice in verse number 26. For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom. So God gives to a man that is good in God's sight wisdom, knowledge, and what's the next one? Joy. Hey, Pastor, why do I not have any joy? Well, you have to be good in God's sight. Well, I'm saved. You might be saved, may not be living for God. You can be saved and still living like the world. When you start living for God and you know your heart's right with God, there's a deep, abiding joy that comes in that man can't produce. The comic, the comedian, the sitcoms, the shows, the cartoons, anything you're trying to find pleasure in cannot produce. The alcohol, the women, the men, the relationships, whatever it is, the theater, the shows, on and on and on. Solomon said, I've tried it all. I had it all. I had men singers and women singers. I had concubines. I had, you name it, I had it, and nothing brought lasting joy. But he said, God will give to those who are good in his sight wisdom, knowledge, and joy. He'll give it to you. But to the sinner, he giveth travail. To gather and to heap up, so the sinner gathers and heaps up all this wealth and riches to himself, that he may give it to him that is good before God. And then he says, this is also vanity and vexation of spirit. The sinner who searches to gather wealth from the world and gather all their fame and all their fortune. And Solomon's saying, it's all vanity, it's all grasping at air, it's all going to die, it's all going to fade away. So let me just conclude with a few thoughts. At the beginning of the lesson this morning, I mentioned about God's purpose. And searching for meaning without God's purpose will result in emptiness. There are some questions that will help us to understand the meaning and purpose of life. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse number 26, you can answer the question out loud if you like, but who created man? God. And I mentioned as we were concluding the message this morning, if you would understand this one concept, it would help you understand the meaning of life. Because the meaning of life is found in man understanding who their Creator is. When I understand that God is my creator, then it makes me now accountable. When I understand that I'm accountable to my God, I ask different questions. Don't you? If I know that God is my creator, then I'm thinking, all right, what's my responsibility then to this creator? If he brought me into this world, he's allowing me to breathe, he's giving me this life, then what's my responsibility to him? And the Bible tells us in Genesis 1:26 that God created man in his image. What? Out of all the different creatures that God created, he created humans in his image? That makes us special. Oh, and you are. Read Psalm 139. Understand that the Lord knew you when you were conceived in your mother's womb. And he had plans for you. How special is that? Say, what's my purpose in life? Understanding what God's purpose is for you. That you're created in his image. That God has a desire for you to understand him and to be used of him. The meaning of life is for us as believers especially to understand that God created us. What is the purpose of life's creation? Look at Psalm 100. If you'll turn with me there, Psalm 100. In verse number 2 and 3, what is the purpose of life's creation? Psalm 100 verses 2 and 3. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, he is God, and it is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Not only is God our creator, and we have to identify that he's the one that made us, but it also says that we are his sheep. We are the sheep of his pasture, meaning now I have accountability to this God who created me, who allows me to come into this world, who gives me breath to breathe. I am responsible now to listen to the shepherd of my soul. This is a part of our purpose. We're here as God's sheep. Well, as God's sheep, what is my responsibility? Not to just graze in the field, to graze at his feet, to graze on his word, but to learn more about him. What are the expectations of those who have a life from this creator? Well, it's to glorify God. Are there any restrictions? Sure. Avoid worldliness. Avoid ungodly things. Seek to understand God's ways. Are there any commands? Yes. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. What was Solomon's problem with his heart? He gave his heart to the wrong things. Did he not? He gave his heart to women. He gave his heart to wine. He gave his heart to pleasure. He gave his heart to his labor. He gave his heart to everything else but his God. Oh, in the beginning he gave his heart to God, but it was slowly pulled away from God, and he gave it to other things that brought him pleasure. What are the guidelines for us? 66 books of the Bible. And what does the Creator say the meaning and purpose of life is? Turn to 1 Samuel chapter number 12. And we'll conclude with this verse. 1 Samuel chapter number 12. And it's repeated similarly in other places of the Bible. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, it's actually for the nation of Israel. And God is reminding the prophet Samuel of the conditions of their blessings from God to the whole nation of Israel. Notice in 1 Samuel chapter 12, and we'll look at we'll go to verse number 23. Moreover, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the what way? Right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in what? Truth, with all your what? Heart. For consider how great things he hath done for you. But if you shall do wickedly, ye shall be consumed, both ye and your what? King. This was a message to the nation of Israel. Sometimes that being consumed came to the next generation. It didn't happen to the generation that was alive at the time. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it didn't. In Solomon's case, he knew that his son was going to have the kingdom divided. He was going to die. He saw it happening because of Solomon's heart being torn away by other things. But he died, and when his son took over, it was already a divided kingdom. And the same God that promised Solomon, Solomon, if you obey me, if you live for me as your father David did, he says, I will be in the temple permanently, and I will bless you. But he said, Solomon, if you turn your heart after other gods, this deal is off. And when Solomon's heart started going towards other things, God said, okay, I've taken the kingdom from you, Solomon. That happened before Solomon died. God told him, kingdom's being taken from you. It's going to be divided. And he had to live with that regret for the rest of his years. And his son had to take over a divided kingdom. And it never was restored. We understand that this sad circumstance is the end of a lesson of a man who said he had all wisdom, but yet was willing to seek out madness and folly. Now please just be reminded that God did not want Solomon to seek out madness and folly. This was what was in Solomon's heart. I think he justified seeking it out because his heart was being pulled away from God. And somewhere in there, as we do sometimes, we can justify our sin to ourselves, not to God, but we can justify our sins and not think about the consequences, perhaps even to the next generation. And it's important for us to consider the truth that Solomon left with us back in chapter number 2, the latter portion. For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom, knowledge, and joy. You want to have those three things in your life? Then the idea of being good, meaning living righteously before your God, he will give you those things. You don't have to seek after making it happen in your life. He will bless you with those things if you truly have the right heart with your God. Father, thank you for the Word of God. Thank you for the privilege of sharing these truths. And Lord, although what we hear from Solomon is negative, we also can see the positive in it in the sense that he does offer us the truth, that living right in your eyes brings about those things which are good for us, that you do want to give us wisdom and knowledge and joy. And it's true wisdom, knowledge, and joy, not manufactured. May we be those who hear this message and heed to it and make it applicable to our own lives. I thank you for this time. I thank you